The sound of the door slamming echoed through the silent hallway like an avalanche breaking through the ice. The noise, although common in that part of the asylum, still made the other residents shudder. On one side of the corridor, Mr. Otto, rigid as a soldier even at 90, was frowning and muttering in low German. On the other side, Dimitri, always wearing a crooked beret and looking suspicious, responded with his cane, hitting the floor hard, as if he wanted to split the wood on purpose. The tension between the two was visible, almost palpable, as if the very air froze between them every time they passed each other. They had shared the same hallway for years, but they never exchanged each other on a good day. In the asylum, surrounded by snow-covered forests and perpetually fogged windows, that patch of floor between the two rooms was a silent war line. While the rest of the residents tried to maintain a calm routine, warmed by hot tea and soft conversations by the fireplace, Otto and Dimitri were busy teasing each other with short glances, crossed words, and an impatience that time was unable to melt. Otto kept his shoes perfectly aligned next to the bed, counted the steps to the cafeteria, and folded his sheets like someone folding a military uniform. Dimitri, on the other hand, preferred controlled chaos, stacked books, scribbled papers, and the radio always at a volume above tolerable. If Otto closed the door, Dimitri opened the window. If Dimitri coughed in the hallway, Otto would bang his cane against the wall. There were two opposing worlds living side by side in the same corridor, frozen by time. For employees, it was already customary to keep their distance when the two were close. The younger caregivers always asked the reason for the rivalry, but no one knew how to answer. There were no records, nor public disagreements that would justify so much aversion. Just silence between them. A dense, ancient silence, as cold as the wind that whistled through the cracks in the wood on winter mornings. On this particular morning, however, there was something thicker in the air. Otto seemed angrier than usual, Dimitri more provocative, and the snow outside fell with a rare insistence, as if announcing that something was about to change. The hallway seemed longer. The clock in the hall was slow to tick. The Cold War between the two seemed about to go up in flames. But neither Otto nor Dimitri knew that they were just a few steps away from discovering that their stories were more similar than they imagined, and that in some forgotten point in the past, their paths had already crossed, just on different sides of the battlefield. In the common room, the armchair closest to the fireplace was always a source of contention. When Otto approached, Dimitri was already sitting. When Dimitri arrived first, Otto found another place to sit, but not before giving him a sharp look and adjusting his posture as if facing an enemy. During meals, one would grumble at the sound of the other chewing. In the garden, while one contemplated the white snow in silence, the other passed by coughing on purpose, breaking the peace of others. It was an involuntary dance of irritations, an endless game where both seemed to forget that time didn't stop. Otto was methodical, always impeccably dressed, his steps steady even at his advanced age. Dimitri was the opposite, unshaven, a sagging beret, an acidic humor that hid something deeper. No one knew for sure how that feud started, but everyone knew that the two couldn't stand each other. And in the freezing silence of that asylum, this was almost a form of communication. If you like stories that warm your heart even in the coldest places, subscribe to the channel now, Frozen Chronicles, because some memories need to be told before they disappear with the snow. It was as if each day carried a new reason for provocation. The silent war between Otto and Dimitri left subtle marks on the asylum's daily life. The newspaper, which arrived punctually every morning, began to mysteriously disappear. Dimitri said he didn't really read, but no one else saw him resting with it folded on his lap. Otto, in turn, spent the morning grumbling, opening and closing drawers, certain that he had been sabotaged. The next day, Otto retaliated, adjusting the salt shaker on the cafeteria table with purposeful generosity, knowing that Dimitri always served himself first. The result was an untouched lunch and a dish too salty to eat. The caregivers, who already knew the two's tricks, tried to distract, separate, and alternate the times at which they crossed the corridors. But the space was small, and the winter outside was increasingly relentless. The snow, which already covered the landscape with its constant white, began to close the accesses to the small town. The forecast was for heavy snowfall, the kind that isolates the place for days. The emergency generator was tested, supplies were recounted, and residents were advised to stay in warmer indoor areas. The most difficult decision, however, was made out of pure necessity. Due to a heating leak in one of the wings, Otto and Dimitri would have to temporarily share the same living room. When they announced it, the two did not hide their disgust. Dimitri shook his head as if regretting his fate. Otto, without saying a word, just pursed his lips tighter and organized his things with military precision. They were both led into the makeshift room where a single fireplace flickered against the stone wall. There were only 2 seats, the blankets shared. The silence between them, however, screamed. The next few hours dragged by. Dimitri leafed through an old notebook, scribbling down loose sentences that looked more like chopped-up memories. Otto kept his eyes on the fire, his hands crossed on his knees. From time to time, they glanced at each other. They weren't just provocations. There was something more. A tension that seemed to come from another time. It was as if the cold outside was giving way to an internal thaw. Night came without them noticing. The storm outside made the building shake. The wind howled through the cracks in the windows, and the crackling of wood on the fire seemed the only living sound in the room. The light flickered, casting flickering shadows on the walls, creating images that resembled silhouettes from the past. It was then that Otto noticed what hung around Dimitri's neck, an old medal hanging discreetly from a chain darkened by time. It wasn't just any medal. Otto knew that symbol, not because of the pride he carried, but because of the blood he saw running through it. At the same time, Dimitri, upon meeting Otto, noticed something he had never noticed before. A mark on the left arm, exposed by a careless movement of the sweater sleeve. A tattooed code, erased by time, but unmistakable to anyone who knew that era. They both looked at each other for longer than usual. The look of provocation gave way to a look of restrained shock. It was as if suddenly the present had disappeared and there were only 2 young men left on opposite sides of a trench. They didn't say anything. There was no need. Whatever had been forgotten, buried, silenced, had been unearthed there between 4 walls with the cold beating outside. In extreme cold, there is no escape from others, nor from one's own past. And that night, with the roar of the blizzard outside, what was between Otto and Dimitri was no longer just feud. It was memory. It was history. It was shared pain that had never found a voice. If before they fought for the fireplace seat, now they shared the same space without knowing how to deal with what they had discovered. The silence was no longer that of someone who couldn't stand themselves, but that of someone who suddenly recognized themselves in others. The missing pieces of their stories had just revealed themselves, and they were there, alive, sitting just a few steps away. The firelight swayed slowly, casting golden reflections on the stone wall and casting flickering shadows on the wooden floor. The wind outside howled louder, as if the world was trying to say something that no one there wanted to hear. Dimitri closed the notebook and set it aside, looking at the flames with tired eyes. Otto, rigid as always, remained completely silent, but there was something different about his posture. Less firm, less armored. He was looking at the neck of the man in front of him with an unusual intensity. Hanging discreetly from a darkened chain, there was a small, ancient medal with marks of time and memory. Otto knew that symbol. It wasn't just an artifact of war. It was a souvenir of a specific day, a day he never forgot. A symbol worn by those who once stood against him, men who fought on the other side with the same conviction, the same fear, the same blood. Dimitri, noticing Otto's gaze, raised his chin lightly as if challenging without words. But his eyes fell by chance on Otto's arm. The sleeve of the sweater had slipped slightly, revealing something that time had not been able to erase. A sequence of numbers and letters tattooed in a rudimentary way. It was no ordinary tattoo. It was a military code, typical of specific combat units. Dimitri knew that. He had seen that same pattern etched into the arm of a man lying in a snow-covered trench many years before. The two men looked at each other. For the first time in years, the silence between them wasn't filled with anger, but with recognition. A slow, silent shock. There was no more provocation. There was no more dispute. Just a revelation so profound that the frozen time around it seemed to melt. Just for a second, there was no need to say anything. They knew. They were in the same battle, in the same white hell, just different sides of the same pain. Faces hardened by time and pride began to lose their masks. Otto's stiffness gave way to a slight tremor in his hand. Dimitri, who never looked down, now stared at the floor as if looking for some explanation in the floor pattern. The room, previously the scene of a rivalry that everyone considered irreconcilable, was now the scene of an unexpected reunion, not from two old neighbors, but of two soldiers who survived the same war, and perhaps carried the same guilt, the same fear, the same loss. Otto was the first to look away. His fingers gripped the armrests tightly, then relaxed. Dimitri still held the notebook, but he was no longer writing anything. Everything that needed to be written was there, between them, hovering like invisible smoke between the flames of the fireplace. The two men who could barely bear to share the same hallway were now linked by a past that no one else there would understand. For years, they hated each other, without knowing that they shared the same trauma. The blizzard outside was roaring fiercely, but inside, the noise was different. It was the sound of a memory opening, of a barrier being crossed. They didn't say anything at that moment, but they knew. Each had been the enemy of the other, and each had survived something that should never have been faced alone. If you have ever experienced an unexpected reconciliation or believe that humanity can be born even between rivals, share it in the comments, because sometimes the only person who can understand your pain is the one who felt it on the other side. The morning came with silence. The wind outside no longer screamed like it had the night before, and the light that came through the windows, although pale, seemed softer. Otto was the first to get up from his seat. He walked slowly to the kettle, heated some water and poured 2 cups. He didn't say anything. He just placed one of them on the table in front of Dimitri, who was still watching the fire, as if it were telling a story that only he could hear. Dimitri accepted the tea with a minimal gesture, almost imperceptible, but full of meaning. It was the first movement towards a truce between two men who, until the previous night, regarded each other with the coldness of contempt. Now, there was something more there, a divided weight, an understanding that only those who went through the same scars could carry. The words came slowly. Names appeared in the air like ghosts summoned by memory. Ivan, Joseph, Thomas. Dimitri mentioned an attack that occurred in a snow-covered forest. Otto silently nodded. He remembered it had been there. At another point, playing for the opposite side, believing it was the right thing to do. Both spoke of a young man who had been pulled out wounded from under the artillery. Dimitri said he was the one who carried the boy on his back. Otto, with a choked voice, said that the young man was a childhood friend, and that he had survived thanks to someone on the other side. It was like putting together a puzzle forgotten by time. Each revealed piece fit perfectly with what the other knew, as if their stories had been written in the same book, but on different pages. For years, they carried the same weight, not knowing that relief could be so close. The insults exchanged, the hard looks, the small provocations, all of this began to slowly crumble. In its place, a slow conversation appeared, marked by long silences and looks that said more than any words could. Otto told of the fear he felt during a nighttime bombing raid, when he thought he would not see the dawn. Dimitri responded with a memory of a winter when he was trapped in an underground shelter for 2 days, hearing only the sound of other soldiers breathing, and his own trying not to go crazy. There was pain in the words, but there was also relief. The kind of relief that only comes when we realize that we weren't the only one to survive with that hidden wound. Sometimes the enemy of the past is the only one who understands what you feel today. There, in that room with old walls and the smell of burning wood, 2 men who believed they had nothing left to learn rediscovered humanity in each other. They were no longer Otto and Dimitri, the grumpy neighbors from the asylum. They were survivors. They were witnesses. They were each other's mirror. If this story moved you, leave a like, because deep down, we all carry scars that only those who were on the other side can understand. And sometimes a simple gesture, like listening, can be everything someone's been waiting for their entire life. The corridor that was once a battlefield now became a path of peace. For the first time in many winters, Otto and Dimitri's footsteps moved side by side. Not in a hurry, nor with that contained tension from before, but with the calm of someone who has finally found a common rhythm. They didn't talk much, and maybe they didn't need to anymore. It was the kind of silence that didn't weigh down, that didn't divide, but united. A shared silence, a silence of understanding. In the cafeteria, the caregivers exchanged discreet glances when they saw the 2 approaching the same table. Otto, always rigid, pulled out the chair for Dimitri with a brief, almost automatic gesture. Dimitri, in turn, adjusted Otto's backrest without saying a single word. When the tea arrived, Otto stood up before the tray was placed on the table, took one of the cups firmly, and handed it to Dimitri with a slight nod. The other took it, without irony, without mockery. It just stuck. That, for those who watched, was more impactful than any reconciliation speech. There was no advertisement. There were no loud apologies. But there was an exchange, careful. Looks that now lasted more than a second. And in the place where the provocative noises previously echoed, now the sound of synchronized footsteps could be heard. In the common room, the fight for the fireplace seat ceased. Instead of rivalry, the 2 seats were side by side, occupied by 2 men who shared memories and scars. It was not uncommon to see them dozing there in silence, as if that moment of peace was something too precious to be interrupted. Sometimes they exchanged a few words about simple things, the taste of the tea, the weather, the color of the morning light. But behind every banal phrase was a silent agreement. The war was over between them. Other residents began to notice. The lady who always sewed near the window commented in a low voice to a caregiver, "I have never seen Otto so calm." The man who read the newspaper every day confided that he thought Dimitri was smiling more. Not an open, wide smile, but one of those little ones that only appear in the corners of the lips when the heart finds rest. And so, The asylum that was previously divided by an invisible line began to carry, in its corridors, the trace of an unlikely friendship. Otto and Dimitri didn't need to justify anything. They didn't need to explain what had changed. They just followed, side by side, sharing the weight of time and the lightness of now. What started with fights ended with shared silence and friendship. There, between walls warmed by the smell of wood and the sound of snow outside, the cold that once separated now seemed to shelter. And everyone, even without understanding how it happened, knew there was something in that silence between them that no winter could freeze again. The morning Dimitri didn't show up for tea was quieter than usual. The armchair by the fireplace, which used to hold his crooked barrette and the sound of his light mumbling, remained empty. Otto didn't ask anything. He just looked at the space next to him as if he knew that absence already carries its own answer. The nurse approached him silently, lightly touched his shoulder, and left an envelope on the table. It was small, folded carefully. Otto caught it with firm hands, but his eyes could no longer support the same weight. Inside, a few handwritten words. The lyrics were recognizable, shaky, but full of intention. "You were my last comrade. Thank you for forgiving me without saying anything." Otto read the sentence slowly, then once more, then yet another. And then, with a long sigh, he lowered the paper onto his lap and fixed his gaze on the flame of the fireplace. There were no tears, just a silence as dense as the first time the two had shared that space. But now, there was another silence, not out of anger, not out of dispute, but out of longing, a silence of gratitude. Otto remained there for hours, taking his time, with the letter folded in his hands. Then he got up, carefully folded the blanket left by Dimitri on the armchair, and placed it on the back. He walked out the door slowly, looking at the corridor as if looking at a field of memory. Each step resonated not only in the walls of the asylum, but in the memories the two had finally allowed to blossom. They shared the same hallway, and in the end, the same frozen heart that only another soldier could warm. This story is a reminder that sometimes the greatest enemies carry similar pain, and that forgiveness, even when silent, can be the most powerful act of all. If this chronicle touched your heart, leave your like to support this type of narrative. Comment below if you have ever experienced or witnessed an unlikely reconciliation. And sign up No Channel Frozen Chronicles for more stories that cross the cold, time, and reach straight to the soul.